Hey guys, it's Shadow the Rat, and for today's video, I wanted to go over what's happened to my rats Bean and Peaches. So some of you might have seen my community post on YouTube or my post on Facebook talking about what happened to Bean, and in that case, this won't be new information, at least when it comes to Bean. So if you want to skip over this, I understand that, and I will leave a timestamp in the description and in the comments so that you can skip to Peach's story if you'd like. Anyways, basically what happened with Bean, and for those of you who don't know, the short story is basically she passed away after an operation, but the story leading up to that is that she was acting a bit off last weekend. She was just not as energetic as usual, and when we did a photo shoot, when we took her to the light box that we usually use to do our photo shoots, she just wasn't investigating. She was kind of just sitting there with her fur slightly puffed, and she was brooksing, which is when they grind their incisors together, and that can be a sign of them being happy and content, but it can also be a sign of them being in pain or uncomfortable or nervous. And unfortunately in this case, looking back, I think it was a sign that she was not feeling very great and was possibly in pain as well, because rats really try to hide these symptoms when they can. So the little things really end up counting when it comes to trying to determine if they are feeling okay or not. So anyways, after that photo session, the next time I saw Bean was during free range, and she came out about halfway through, which was kind of weird because usually she would be one of the first rats out, but sometimes she had off days like any rat, and she did end up coming out and training some with Sugar on some versus basketball, which is what I was working on with Sugar, so I wasn't super concerned. That is until I ended up flipping Bean over and giving her a treat, just because I kind of like doing that, and Bean was completely fine with that. So I did that, and unfortunately while she was eating the treat, I saw some blood well up from her urethra. So just as a side note here, if you ever see your rats bleeding from their privates, they very much do need to go to the vet, because this is a very serious thing. Rats do not get periods, so if you have a female rat that's bleeding, it's not because they're on their period or something like that, it's because something is going wrong internally, and you very much do need to get them into the vet as soon as you can. And same goes for male rats. If they're bleeding down there, definitely get them to the vet as soon as you can. Okay, so with that being said, when I saw Bean bleeding down there, I knew immediately that I would have to take her into the vet as soon as possible. However, she was still acting pretty normal, so I thought it would be okay to wait until morning, and honestly, even if she hadn't been acting normal, I would have had to wait till morning, because the only vet around here that does 24/7 service, and it was around 11 o'clock at night at this point, anyways, the only vet that does 24/7 service around here is the general vet, and they just don't know anything about rats. They would only be able to give me antibiotics and tell me, just hope for the best, which is not their fault. They just don't deal with rats very much, and the emergency people there deal with rats even less. I've been there before for emergency, and pretty much the only thing they can treat is respiratory issues or other infections, and even then it's fairly limited. Anyways, I ended up sleeping with Bean down here because, well, I was very worried about her, and in the morning when I woke up, she was acting very different. She was puffed up, she was pretty lethargic, she was cold to the touch, not super cold yet, but when rats start to lose their body temperature, something's going wrong. Often that's a sign, unfortunately, that they are dying. So I knew that was very serious. And on top of that, she was showing some pica behaviors, and pica is basically when they start to eat non-food items, which is very strange for rats. They're usually really good at not eating non-food items. They'll chew them up and spit them out, but they won't actually try to ingest them. And Bean was actually trying to eat her bedding, which is something I've only ever seen her do when she's in pain. The only other time I saw her do this was when she had a tumor removed about a year ago, and she was on painkillers, but they hadn't kicked in yet, and that's the only time I've ever seen her try to eat the bedding or anything that wasn't a food. So I knew this was very serious, and so I put her in my shirt to warm her up some, and I took her upstairs, and it was just a testament to how bad she was feeling, because she just didn't move around. Even though I brought her upstairs, and she'd usually be very curious about the new space because she's usually not brought up there, she just kind of laid there under my blanket, and it was just, it was just very sad, because that just wasn't Bean. She was clearly not feeling great, and it just wasn't how she would usually act. So I called the vet at 7:30 in the morning, which is when they opened, and I got a response really quickly. They're really good about that, and basically I was told this is definitely an emergency and you need to bring her in as soon as possible. They were actually booked for the day, but they got me in for an emergency appointment because, again, they know rats and they know how serious this is, so they tried to get us in as soon as possible. Unfortunately, this vet is around 45 to 50 minutes away from me, so we had to drive a fair ways to get there. But once we got there, they greeted us with all sorts of stuff to stabilize Bean. They got her on a heating pad, they started her on fluids. They just did everything they could to make sure that she got as stable as possible while she was waiting for the test to determine what was going on. So they told me that I would get to pick her up at 4:30 and they would call me throughout the day to just kind of update me on what was going on and if I had to make any sort of decisions. And so at around 10:30 I got a call, and basically they told me that they had done an x-ray and ultrasound and they couldn't really find anything wrong. Bean did have a slightly enlarged heart, which is not uncommon in older rats. However, it wasn't large enough to be causing any sort of symptoms, and it certainly wouldn't have caused the sort of symptoms we were seeing here. So they were saying because she's still bleeding, there's pretty much only two options here. You can either have her euthanized, or you can have an emergency exploratory surgery of the bladder and kidney area, because that's where they determined that the blood was coming from. And this was a hard decision because Bean had lost a fair bit of blood, so I knew her chance of getting through the surgery wasn't going to be great. And this was something that the vet confirmed. But they said that Bean did well with sedation. She woke up right away because of course she had to be sedated for the x-ray and ultrasound. So I decided to try and go through with it and see if she could make it through the surgery and we could figure out what was going on. So they went through with the surgery and they found out that basically Bean's uterus, one side, was completely cancerous. It was pretty swollen. It had some really large blood clots. I actually got to see it, so that was just something she offered to me afterwards, and I was kind of curious about it, so it definitely looked pretty bad. And, well, the blood clots were what I saw coming out of her urethra. Actually, that was kind of weird, because usually the uterus, apparently blood from there wouldn't be draining out the urethra, but Bean seemed to be lacking a bladder, which was very strange. My vet just couldn't find the bladder at all. It seemed to just not be there. So she said that she thought that Bean might have been born without a bladder even, because she couldn't find any remnants of it. She couldn't find any urine in the abdominal cavity, which you would find if the bladder had ruptured. And she said that explained why the blood was coming from the urethra, even though it was originating from the uterus. Honestly, I do not know anatomy. I'm just repeating what she said to me. So apparently Bean had some weird anatomy going on. She actually had some weird deformation of the trachea too. We found the first time surgery around, just that it was more narrowed or something like that. So unfortunately that is just something that Bean was dealing with. She honestly lived a pretty good life, considering that it seems like she had some weird things going on internally. But anyways, Bean did come through the surgery well. She did really well. She didn't have any sort of issues. She didn't crash during the surgery. But unfortunately, a few minutes into recovery, after they had finished, her blood pressure ended up dropping and she passed away. And the end conclusion was that she passed away because she had just lost too much blood and her body just couldn't cope. So unfortunately, even though she made it through the surgery, she just never made it to waking up. And that's just how it is. I mean, you know, she really didn't have a huge chance of even making it through the surgery, let alone recovering. So, you know, yeah, I feel bad about it. I'm glad we went through with the surgery, but again, unfortunately, Bean just didn't make it, and that's that. I do kind of feel guilty that I didn't have her spayed about a year ago. Some of you will remember she had a tumor removed, and when she had the tumor removed, I had the option to spay her. In fact, the vet talked to me about it, and she offered it, and, well, I just decided against it. I mean, I had a few commenters ask me if I was going to get her spayed, too, and I don't really know why I decided against it, honestly. I feel pretty guilty about it now, but I know it's in the past, and, you know, you just can't change that. Sorry. But, you know, I just decided against it. I think part of it was I was afraid to have her under for longer than necessary because it was my first time getting a tumor removed from a rat, and also, you know, Bean was one of my heart rats, so having her go under was very difficult. It was my first time at that vet too, and, well, it just, overall, it accumulated in me just deciding against it, and looking back, I do wish I went through with it because since Bean had, you know, cancer of the uterus, well, if she was spayed, she would have had the uterus removed along with her ovaries, and not only would she have been less likely to develop cancer, because rats that are spayed, female rats that are spayed, have less of a chance of developing cancer, especially in old age. It's actually most effective to spay them before around 5 to 6 months of age, but even if you do it later on, it does reduce the chance of them getting tumors, simply because they're usually hormone related. And, well, again, I just decided against it for some reason, and, well, that's that. I mean, Bean would have passed sooner rather than later, probably just because of her age. Rats only live 2 to 2.5 years on average, unfortunately, and Bean was 25 months old. But at the same time, I feel like, she could have had some more time if I had gone through with that spay a year ago. But again, there's no use looking in the past, because the past is the past. So, I'll just make sure that if I have a rat that gets tumors early on, and I know is genetically prone to them because of that I will go through with spaying them as well. So I will let this help to influence my future decisions in a better way. Anyways, that's pretty much what happened to Bean. And the next rat I wanted to talk about is Peaches. Peaches also unfortunately passed away, however in a different way than Bean. Peaches actually passed away a few days before Bean, and what happened with Peaches is she actually had heart failure, which is pretty common in older rats. And this is when their heart becomes enlarged and it becomes harder for it to pump blood around the body, and it does get worse with time. It's usually a chronic issue, and in Peach's case it was a chronic issue. And while there are medications you can use to help lessen the symptoms and slow down the progress of the disease, it will eventually kill them. And in Peach's case, not only did she have heart failure going on, but she also had hindline degeneration that was starting, and she also had a benign tumor that started under her leg. It was around the size of a grape when she passed, and while that doesn't sound big, considering that Peaches was a small rat, her max weight was around 280 grams, and she actually got down to around 250 grams because she lost pretty much all interest in foraging for food and doing tricks for food. That's actually why she didn't show up in many of my videos, because she just didn't have interest for foraging or doing tricks anymore, and I wasn't going to push it. And she just wasn't a human social rat, really, so, when we didn't have those activities to do together, she pretty much would just do her own thing. But that's when she was losing a lot of weight. That's actually why I ended up putting food in my cage in bowls again, because I was using foraging toys only for a while, but during that time, Peaches was just losing so much weight, so I had to start putting the food back in bowls. And she did end up gaining back around 10 grams with the food in bowls and some supplemental feedings, but unfortunately she never gained back all that weight. She was only at around 260 grams. Just in general, she was old. She was nearly 2.5 years old, possibly older, and on top of that, she was just kind of sickly, and she was still getting around pretty well. She was able to walk around and interact with the other rats, but I think the best word to describe her would be frail. She just wasn't, able to run around as much as she used to, and she was getting to the point where I was thinking about having her put down, just because her quality of life did seem to be decreasing. She did end up passing in her sleep before I could do that, and in a way I'm glad, because she was a very nervous rat, so I'm just glad she was able to pass in a place that she was familiar with. Anyways, that's pretty much it for this update here. I know that it's, pretty depressing. Unfortunately, these are the things that come along with having rats. They only live around 2 to 2.5 years again, and I know that's just such a short time period. Honestly, I used to make videos like this describing what happened a lot, but I think it just gets too depressing to, talk about it like this so much. I do enjoy making the memo videos. I think those are a great way for me to kind of reflect back on their life and just see it in a more positive light, which can be difficult after they pass. But since rats pass so often, especially if you have a larger group, you need to have some way to cope with it, because if you don't, then, it's just absolutely detrimental. But I have had rodents, and short-lived rodents in particular, for now, I think 15 years. 16 years actually. I got my first hamster, I want to say. Yeah, my first dwarf hamster when I was 5 years old. So I've had them for a long time, and unfortunately that's just a trademark of rodents. They're just such awesome and sweet pets, but they just don't live very long on average. Of course, there are some that live longer, but the pocket pets tend to live a pretty short life. Anyways, I hope this answers any questions you had about Bean and Peaches. And for those of you wondering, I will be posting Peach's tribute video at some point soon. But other than that, there's not really too much else to talk about. I'm just going to go ahead and end this here. And yeah, I will see you guys later. Bye!